So our guest, James Ford, today is a Zen priest. He is one of the consulting ministers at the First Unitarian Church of Los Angeles, which I attend, and that's where I met him. According to Wikipedia, he's the first Unitarian Universalist minister to be named a Zen master. He created the Empty Moon Zen Network, which is a network of Zen centers in California, Washington State, and Pennsylvania, as far as I understand. And he's the author of a handful of books about Zen, the most recent of which is an introduction to Zen Koans. Welcome to the podcast, James.
Well, thank you, Matthew. I'm glad to be here.
Absolutely. So I want to start with where I usually start and blast back to the past. Can you tell us a little bit about how religious or non-religious your childhood was?
Sure. So I have two, different pillars in my intentions in my childhood. The on the one hand, the spiritual center of the family was my maternal grandmother, and we were a very small family unit. And I learned to read out of a King James Bible resting on her lap, big illustrated version. So there is that.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, my father was a scoffing atheist, an admirer of Robert Ingersoll, of the great agnostic of the 19th century, who kind of tended to do the kind of the very low hanging fruit kind of mockery of four corners of the earth, and and big fishes swallowing people, but it was definitely the other pole in my childhood. So I kind of was raised between those two things.
I got you. Did you, when you were a kid, did you feel like you gravitated to one of those poles more than the other?
Oh yeah. I was religious. I was very, my fantasies was I was going to grow up and be a preacher.
Nice. Okay.
As a child. Generally, it's adolescence that shifts the world.
Right. Did you, before we move away from your, younger days, do you remember having any, for lack of a better phrase, spiritual experiences when you were a kid or an adolescent?
Well, as a kid, well, I lived in my grandmother's world, and she lived in a haunted world, so there were ghosts and spirits and things in her life, and I just assumed that was part of the makeup of the universe. My personal experiences were more mundane. I think probably actually for my spiritual life, I think the most important, very early thing that I noticed was one Sunday, this is back when people read newspapers. You may have heard the term. The Sunday section had a comics section, which was like full 4-color, and just really cool. And I remember once with the Sunday paper, the comic book, the comic section on the floor, reading it, and I realized, well, this is how we look at it. What if I were from Mars, and I turned it upside down, and I looked at it upside down, and all of a sudden this different universe, these little squiggles were there, and these balloons and pictures that were slightly off, and I had this intimation that maybe the world was not exactly as I thought it was. That's would be my first. That's the earliest thing I recall.
So you grew up, I assume, maybe going to a Christian church of some sort?
We followed my grandmother, who followed the Holy Spirit. Um, we ended up mainly, we generally Baptist churches,
Okay.
Christian Missionary Alliance. But it was kind of like the last church I actually, attended
Okay.
as a um, um, which is it's a Baptist body, and one of those accidental denominations. They formed as a missionary to support missions, and they accidentally became a tiny denomination.
Okay. What was it that originally sparked your interest in Buddhism?
Well, in the late 1960s, I lived in the Bay Area. There, at some point, I realized psychedelics were not going to save the world, and I started looking for something that might work for me. And if you're interested in the world's range of spiritualities, living in the San Francisco Bay Area in 1968 is not a bad place.
Right.
And I visited a lot of things. I saw a lot of teachers and gurus of the time. And people kept saying, well, you really should check out Shunryu Suzuki. And then there's these, wild stories and things from outside of the Zen world. And I ended up, finally, I have a longer and well-polished story that even I'm becoming bored with. The upshot was I began practicing in a branch, the Berkeley Zendo, which was a branch of the San Francisco Zen Center at the time. And I would hear him I would go over and hear him give talks, but I never actually met him. The local person, Mel Weitzman, would be my first mentor in the Zen way. Although it's one of those ones where he didn't have the right color robe, so I didn't realize he was my teacher.
Well, it seems like it's common for people, especially coming out of the 60s and 70s, to kind of shift from psychedelics to Buddhism, I think. And so I assume you had some psychedelic experiences that kind of made you start, I don't know, seeing the world in a different way, but you didn't think it was sustainable to just rely on psychedelics to, sustain that.
I had I'd read Aldous Huxley, and
Mm-hmm.
I believe psychedelics were a spiritual tool. Maybe they are, but they certainly weren't for me.
Mm-hmm.
I thought, in my experience, it would be that psychedelics teach one lesson. And it's a worthy lesson, and it's a version of what I saw with the comics when I was whatever it was. The world is not the way we think it is.
Yeah.
World-shaking, important piece of information.
Yeah.
After that, it's just getting high.
Yeah. Once you get the message, hang up the phone type of thing.
Well, that's how I saw it. I mean, that was for me. It was it, and I don't want to underplay the importance of that encounter, but I didn't see a spiritual path there. Not that I was smart enough to realize there was a spiritual path, but I had an intimation there was something lacking, and I was looking for something, that maybe had a little more staying power.
Yeah, sure.
And there are other things. It's not just Buddhism, I would say. People, Hinduism is,
Sure.
and I've looked at that a little bit. The Sufis were there. Sikhs. There are a lot of spiritual traditions, and
Totally.
and yeah. But Buddhism resonated for me, and it also had that. It had a little bit of that. There's still kind of the rational element is respected in the. In a contradictory sort of way.
Yeah. When was it that Unitarian Universalism became, got put in your world?
Well, so I my path was, in the Zen world.
Yes.
I became a monastic, was ordained a priest, left the monastery after a couple of years, and it was not it was very important to me, not a completely positive experience. And
Hmm.
I was looking for some way to balance um, practices, my spiritual practices, with a community that kind of worked better for me.
Hmm.
There weren't a lot of, I mean, for Zen in now we're talking the early 70s. Um, 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 it was basically, if it wasn't a monastery, it was a gym. You went and you did your practice and you went home.
Hmm.
There no things. And I tumbled out of the monastery, and I was kind of like, actually I was lost for a few years.
Hmm.
I checked a number of things out. I thought about is there a way to reclaim my connections to my natal Christian tradition, and I really like the Episcopalians and such, but
Hmm.
I just, I didn't believe the core story,
Right.
and that sort of, was a problem. And and I'm trying to remember. Oh, I was working in a used bookstore, and I was in charge of the religion section. And one of the cool things about the very large bookstore, was they had a rack of pamphlet literature, and I just loved it. It was every crank thing that you've ever heard of. One of my favorites was a pamphlet that proved that through a conspiracy of the Egyptians and the Brits, they moved all the pyramids from Ireland to Egypt.
Yeah.
Great stuff. And there in the midst of it was something called On Unitarian Christianity. It
Hmm.
was an early 19th century sermon, which was being reprinted in these little pamphlets. And the one I had, I can't remember, it was from the late 19th century. And I read it, William Ellery Channing, and I thought,
Yeah.
this is the best thing since sliced cheese. And I promptly went to the local Unitarian church, fell asleep during the sermon. But I felt there was something, clearly it was not that religion was gone,
Yeah.
the William Ellery Channing's Unitarian Christianity, but something had evolved that was kind of intriguing, and I flirted with it for a few years, got really serious with it, and then became my professional life as well as
Yeah.
the anchor of my, well, at the same time there, what I'd found was a lay Zen teacher, doing in one of the Koan schools from Japan. And for me, they filled what each lacked.
Hmm.
That the Zen thing was like the heart of my heart and my practice, but like nothing about community. Really
Hmm.
gym, a gym of the heart, if you will. But the manifestation, the how to put it together, the Unitarian Church worked for me. It really
Yeah.
did the thing, and there was no competing spirituality. So
Right.
uh,
Yeah.
so
That's one really great thing about you is that, all are accepted.
all are accepted. I mean, it's got a shadow. I mean, the tension is believing anything you want.
Right.
You really can't. Believing anything you want is, I mean, that's frankly that's Orthodox Christianity. There's I don't
Yeah.
want to believe anything I want. I want to believe what I have to believe,
Yeah.
what I'm forced to believe. And between those two things, I think it happened for me. And
Yeah.
other people do it in different ways, and I've seen people do it, in the UU world, just without within the shorthand for Unitarians, Unitarian Universalists.
Right.
So without the addition of another tradition, but most of the people I've seen who've gone deep have something else,
Yeah.
maybe historically Christian universalism or something like that. Metaphysical people, Buddhists, Hindus. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. In the early 70s, when you were kind of having a pull toward trying to figure out how to preserve some traces of your
Yeah.
childhood Christianity, but then not believing in kind of the traditional core story, but also feeling like there was something there in the Christian tradition that is, important. And I kind of I'm similar in that way, I think, because I grew up, my parents are both very traditional Christians, and I grew up going to a Methodist church. And in college, I really got into reading the Bible, and I was going to small group, Bible studies. And so I've had a long journey with that, and I ended up, really straying away from those Christian roots and getting into Buddhism. And in the last few years, I kind of maybe in some way feel like you did in the early 70s about, just at the very least, I was returning to, I returned and I read the Gospels again and tried to read them with fresh eyes and try to figure out, like, because even all the years of not thinking much about Christianity, or I still honor a lot of things about the Gospels. And so rereading them in the last couple of years has given me some, I don't know, fresh perspective. But I'm curious, what is it about the Christian tradition that you think is worth preserving?
Well, I think Christianity is a wonderful religion. I mean, and I have, and part of me is always going to be a Christian. I mean, it's, even if it's cultural Christianity, there are connections. The content of my dreams are formed by biblical Christianity, by the King James Bible specifically, by the felt puppets on the in my Sunday school classes.
Yeah.
And I am at a point where probably my dream content is equally occupied by the Chan tradition, teachers, and the encounters that form the stories that are the background of Koan practice. But at least that level, and probably a little bit deeper, is the Christian thing. So part of it is just the luck of the draw, and it's the thing that I'm stuck with.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I have, in my old age, I've seen the mystical tradition of Christianity that you see expressed in a variety of ways. I particularly like the English tradition, the Cloud of Unknowing, and Julian of Norwich, and that crowd. But you also see it on the continent, the Flemish mystics, Meister Eckhart.
I love Meister Eckhart.
Yeah, love Meister Eckhart, and all through the tradition, there is this countervailing to the kind of the hard story that you're supposed to believe and sign the document on, and the mystery that constantly unfolds. I like to tell a small anecdote about visiting. I was invited to be a teacher at a Zen retreat in Connecticut, and the leader of the community that's brought me out is an Episcopal priest, and she's an authorized Zen teacher. There's that whole Christian Zen thing, which is really, really interesting, and I really, really adore her and respect her, and think she's just the cat's pajamas. But the way the retreat was structured, it ended, early in the morning on Sunday. And part of the reason it ended early in the morning on Sunday was that she had to go say mass. And I asked if I could tag along, and it was kind of a hoot. Her main job, she's a therapist, but she's the not a rector, a vicar of of a little congregation that meets in a stone chapel on the grounds of a retreat facility that is owned by the diocese. And so we were in this little stone, very English chapel with 10, 20 people in it. And there was a moment when, as she was going through the mass, there was the spot where you could see, as she moved to the consecration of the elements, that the roof blew off the ceiling. Angels were there. The entire universe was circling around the navel of the universe, and it was that communion service. And I thought, whoa, yeah. You don't have to worry about the theology, and you just are being present to the thing. The mystery is there. It's a constant. No wonder people become holy in that. And I just thought, oh, geez, if I lived there, I'd just go to her church.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. That's cool. Yeah, for sure. I definitely study mysticism from all the great traditions, and yeah, Christian mysticism has a really rich history. And I mean, when we interpret Christian symbolism symbolically, instead of literally, it can be, in my experience, it can be really meaningful. And like you're saying, I mean, strip away all the theology and just you can have direct experience of the mystery, which in some ways is the core of mysticism from all traditions, honoring and encountering the mystery, the ineffable mystery. So I wanted to ask, it's related to everything we've been talking about, but I would love to hear how you see in your, presently, how would you describe your spiritual worldview, or your spiritual philosophy, I guess?
Yeah. Well, I guess I some years ago, I actually found a little formula, and I realized, what was it? Just the other day, I was reflecting on it and realizing how it remains true for me. But Erasmus, the Enlightenment philosopher, he's a Catholic priest. He's Dutch. There's a famous story about one Friday, some theologians or people are coming by, walking down the street, and in front of an inn, there's Erasmus, and he's eating a sausage. And they say, Erasmus, it's Friday. He says, alas, I do have a Catholic heart, but unfortunately, I have a Lutheran stomach. And it inspired me to see in myself, I have a physiology of faith, and I say I have a Buddhist brain, I have a Christian heart, and I have a humanist, rationalist stomach. And so the Buddhist analysis, especially the Mahayana Buddhist analysis, is true.
Yeah.
And yet I dream of Jesus and the Marys.
Yeah.
And it's all washed through a pretty hardcore. If you claim it manifests in the world, it can be measured. Stance in life. And so that's me. I love
that.
In a nutshell.
Buddhist brain, Christian heart, and humanist stomach.
Yeah, or rationalist. Yeah.
Rationalist, humanist stomach. That's good. Um, you mentioned, we don't have to say much about this, but you mentioned how when you were, and I'm sure you still are interested in traditions like Sufism. You mentioned that Hinduism. Did you end up in when you were kind of exploring different traditions? Did you go to any services that were related to any of those traditions?
Yeah, yeah. In my early before Buddhism, I looked very. I'm quite young then. I'm in my late teens, but I looked very closely as a 17-year-old,
Yeah.
something, at Vedanta. I was super impressed with Ramakrishna, and especially Vivekananda, and
Mm-hmm.
I read a boatload of material. I came into it through through Christopher Isherwood, and I, as a side thing, I really liked Gerald Hurd, and that kind of
Mm-hmm.
Anglo mystical crowd,
Yeah.
and and uh, um, and it wasn't, it didn't. When I moved from the reading about it to visiting the local
Right.
Vedanta center, my prejudices were in the way.
Mm.
They had pews, and I wasn't ready for pews. And the Swami, who was the minister there, he wasn't even a better preacher than the Baptist ministers.
Mm.
So it just didn't work.
Mm-hmm.
In
Mm-hmm.
fact, the luck of the draw in the moment. um, um, Sufism I had a bigger connection to, and after I left the monastery, I really spent some time looking into the Universalist Sufism that
Mm.
came from, like, the first Sufi to really teach in the West was actually, he was a musician, but he was brought over by the University of California to to do presentations on Indian music,
Mm.
and stuck around as he was a Sufi, and he just stuck around and started teaching. But he would, specifically, he'd let people initiate people into the tariqa who were not Muslims,
Mm.
and um, uh, there's a lineage that came out. Actually, there's a number of them that happened in the very beginning of the 20th century, and I
Mm-hmm.
was fascinated with him and his work, and I actually lived for a 2 years uh,
Mm.
in a Sufi khanqa.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. The Ishmael in my name was given to me by a Sufi sheikh.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, but apparently I was only there to meet Jan, and neither of us, even our spiritualities just did not work for that.
Mm.
Um, and you know, and from there was when I actually um, found the Zen group that I would end up working within for the rest of my life,
Mm-hmm.
and Unitarian Universalism about the same time.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So you met Jen there. She was dabbling in Sufism as well,
Dabbling in Sufism. She had,
huh?
yeah. She had gone through. She had dropped out of university, out of UCLA, to join the revolution, and she ended up in the Bay Area, San Francisco. She was a draft counselor for first. She was for the American Friends Service Committee, and then she went. They weren't quite radical enough, so she went to work for the Central Committee on Conscientious Objection. And
Mm.
when all that ended, she was trying to figure out what to do with her life, and she became a typesetter, and was looking for what was the spiritual thing for her. And
Mm-hmm.
so she attended workshops with Starhawk and things, and she ended up in the Sufi community, and that's what. And about 6 months later, I showed up,
Nice.
and then a year, 6 months after that, a year after that, I was gone. We were gone. We left.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Got you. Before we move on, you mentioned Vedanta, and I'm curious. I think about the similarities and differences between some of these traditions, and it seems like I've looked into Advaita Vedanta a lot in the last year or so. And so it seems like, Advaita Vedanta basically says that at the core of our being, we have Atman, which is ultimately no different from Brahman, the absolute. And from my understanding, Atman is usually understood as something like pure consciousness. And so pure consciousness is kind of equated in some way with the absolute. And I know that Buddhism, and of course, Advaita Vedanta actually was influenced by Buddhism because that specific tradition came later. But as far as the Vedic tradition of seeing the absolute as, unconditioned and eternal, that sort of thing. Whereas Buddhism usually is kind of rebelling against that sort of eternalism.
Right.
And so, but then in Buddhism, we have emptiness, which I know that emptiness is understood as very different from something like Brahman, but or even Atman. But at the same time, for some reason, I sometimes I feel like it's just different language for the same thing. Like, so do you have any thoughts about, because I know that you've mentioned that you think that kind of that non-dual realization that is related to emptiness is kind of central to the quote unquote, religious sensibility or religious experience of people from all over the world throughout history. So can you say anything about the relationship between emptiness that in Buddhism versus something like Brahman in Hinduism?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, my knowledge of Hinduism is pretty superficial, but that's never stopped me from having an opinion. As you know, Buddhism is a reaction to Vedic religion, and Buddhism categorically rejects Atman as understood in Vedic religion, and emptiness. There's an evolution of emptiness, of course, in Buddhism, what people what that actually means. But by the time you get to you're in the Mahayana, it's emptiness of of all substances. There is no core. It's all empty. But then with Nagarjuna, and then of course in the flowering in Zen and everything else, the exact identity of form and emptiness. It's not and there's potentiality and things arise out of that. Mm-hmm. As I understand Advaita Vedanta, it is kind of like the Catholic counter Reformation to the Protestant Reformation. It responds to that. I believe Advaita Vedanta is the Vedic response to the Buddhist challenge, and it offers a very in my view, all religions are false. They're all human products. Most of what they're about is crowd control, and although I'm becoming a little bit more I'm hesitant about that. It's about societal cohesion, mm-hmm. And which is often crowd control, but that's a very important job in it, and religion is the territory of religion. But the part that matters to me is the healing of the wound. Mm-hmm. What is it that what is this longing that human beings have, and
Mm.
how do we approach it? And I believe Buddhism approaches it in an enormously practical way and offers specific practices and things that help us on our way. And the the metaphysics of it, to the degree that they're important, are is pretty radical, non-dual in the sense. Advaita Vedanta comes along and says, yeah, right, and it's God, and
Right.
and and then I look at the theists of, I have, my heart is drawn to the Christians, and and same thing, and it's God.
Yeah.
uh, um, what Buddhism helps me deconstruct is the whole idea of a God that's a big human in the sky.
Right.
We're not talking about anything even vaguely like that, and or at least in Advaita Vedanta, not even in the in the Christian mystical traditions.
Mm-hmm.
There's a spot where you cross a line,
Right.
and um, and then it's just presence. It's just presence,
Yeah.
and so for me, what I like about the little tiny bit I understand about Advaita Vedanta is its challenges to the assumptions of Mahayana Buddhism, and it helps me loosen the grips on ideas and tumble ever more fully into the mysteries of unknowing.
Yeah.
So
Beautiful.
yeah,
Thank
so
you.
I'm for it.
Yeah. Well, so I know you've worked with koans for decades,
Right.
and I know that's a big part of your practice. And, koans. So in college, I read, well, as cliche as it sounds, I read Jack Kerouac's Dharma Bums.
Yeah.
And that's really one of the first things that planted the seed for my interest in Buddhism. So I read that. And then I found my way to Alan Watts, and I read The Way of Zen. And then I just started reading a bunch of Buddhist books, And one of the first Buddhist books after The Way of Zen was a collection of koans. And, I was into literature. I was an English major. And so, I was into poetry and literature. So koans were fantastic because they were a blend between the Zen spirituality that I had started to resonate with, but also there was this literary thing about the koans, and so I've read that collection several times. I have a couple koan collections, and then once I moved to LA, I was lucky enough, before I even found the first Unitarian church, I found Angel City Zen Center, and it was the koan night that they have that I like, that I continue to enjoy the most. So there's so many things to say about koans, but I know you've written a book about it, and you've worked with koans for so long, and I know that it's your practice and your interest in koans is not superficial at all. Like it's very deep for you. So I'm curious, like, what do koans offer in your practice?
Yeah. So koans are uh, traditionally they're stories, they're anecdotes that come out of the encounters between teachers and students and teachers, and they're mainly pulled out of the hagiographies of early medieval China, called the lamp anthologies, and then gathered, and then they became tools in spiritual practice. Actually, my favorite potential origin of koans is Victor Sogen-Hori, who's this kind of participant observer, the scholar and Rinzai priest. He said he's moderately confident that Buddhist monks observed Taoists indulging in a drinking game. And the drinking game was somebody would, lubricated. Somebody would sing a verse, and then the next person had to match it, in a way that the observers would all agree fit. And it would go on until somebody lost. And it has analogs in other parts of the world, religions. But the Buddhists said, we can work with that. They dropped the booze. And so what a koan actually is an assertion about reality, and an invitation to stand in that place. And so Buddhist spiritual directors would use, these stories, these anecdotes, these sometimes a phrase or even a word, and it would be an invitation for the student to recognize their identity with this in the most, in the mysterious manner of presence, and the presumption is that the teacher knows gold from tin. And guides people together. Now, in its origins in medieval China, generally you worked with a koan. You would have a koan, you just sort of like work with it for the rest of your life. There would be a koan. Japan developed a curricular style where you go deep with one koan, usually what they call a dharmakaya, one of the questions that particularly address the fundamental matter. What is this emptiness or openness or boundlessness or that thing, and what's my relationship with it, and spend a few years on that, and then visit other koans in a quasi systemized way, to deepen and polish the way. And I trained at one of those schools that do that. So for me, the idea of koans as objects for conversation and things, I think that's absolutely delightful and useful, and not what I do.
Wow. So do you kind of work over a long period of time with a single koan usually?
Well, you usually, in our system, in our style, you begin, like I said, with one of the dharmakayas. 99.9% of the time we use the mu koan, because it does, a student of the way goes to Chow Chow and asks, does a dog have Buddha nature? Chow Chow says mu, which variously can be translated as no. Or nothing, or not, or just empty, and that's and then generally you throw the story away and you just have this noise, and then you investigate it, with assistance of a teacher, and that usually takes a few years to begin to crack what that's about. If you're a serious practitioner, forever if you're not, or 1 minute if you're lucky.
Right. Do you I assume that Zazen is a big part of your practice as well?
Yeah, in the school of Zen I practice, there is no separation between, the foundation is quiet sitting, just sitting. And there are koan teachers, people in my own line who say you don't really need to sit to do the koans, but I find it becomes an intellectual game, and it's not rooted enough if sitting practice is not at the base of it. So for me, the sitting is the koan.
I like that. That might be the title of this episode. Great. Well, those are all the questions I wanted to ask you. I've really appreciated this conversation. I know we could talk for a long time about all these matters. And I'm really grateful that I've gotten a chance to know you a little bit. And I appreciate you taking the time to do this.
Really, really, really fun, Matthew. Thank you for inviting me to do this.
Absolutely. Well, I will talk to you soon, James. I'll send you the link when this is up.
Thank you.
All right. Take care.